is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought, and I am doing any other recent reads. I guess it'll be Saturday or Sunday when this drops. It was gonna be a Friday, but we didn't have sunlight yesterday, so now that it's out, I shall strike, and hopefully, like the last video, or unlike it, the sun will last. We will see. The first book that I want to talk about is Freedom, which is Daemon #2 by Daniel Suarez. The last video I did the first book, which is just called Daemon, and it's a techno-thriller cyberpunk book, one that gets a lot of word of mouth generally. The second book is barely passable, basically. It's hard to talk about without spoilers, so this will be slightly spoilery, no more than if you had read the back of the book. A demon has gotten loose and has organized basically like crime syndicates and different team players, and then a counter same sort of, not program, but industrious human-led project is doing the same. And there is a degree of hybrid reality that is occurring, meaning that everybody is using augmented reality with glasses or what have you to control drones and other things like that, anything in virtual space, and hacking, and to visually see essentially how each person physically is in this game that is occurring. They have a certain level, a certain amount of like acumen, and a certain lot of powers that they can do in this digital space, and there's a war going on. It's a lot more gonzo. It is not as interesting as the first book because all those concepts were already in use, though it is pretty prescient for where it extrapolates a hybrid reality systems to be. Otherwise, it feels a lot like watching like an MMO or something like that, where these characters are larger than life and have a different world, but they're still going around with, you know, assault rifles and things, trying to take over the actual country, and, you know, calling themselves warlocks and other weird stuff like that. So it's just so beyond the pale that it's a lot to sign up for. And while it does tell a story, again, in a very commercial fiction kind of way, it's nothing special whatsoever. Though at the time of its publication, at least for the first one, is in the 90s. And that is very clever in its extrapolation of technology and where it was going at the time. Whereas this, not as much, but still somewhat. Like, hybrid reality is not something that you see in techno-thrillers or even cyberpunk to this day. So there is that. But he was unable to do it without doing it a kind of like the disservice of making it seem like a shooter, video game, popcorn fiction type of thing. So, mixed bag. I then read Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. Not much to say about this. I gave this 3 stars. It was fine. It was different than the story that I knew, of course, in Disney, but also I'm not a child, and there's not much going on with it thematically that is beyond the Disney version, i.e. growing up. It's a lot darker, though, that's for sure. Pan is even less of a nice person, and there is some more deaths, so I guess the stakes are a little bit higher in this. It's more like a dark fairy tale version of it. And it was fine, yeah. Like, I'll never read it again kind of deal, but I'm glad that I experienced it for, 4 hours or whatever it was. I then finished The Infinite Blacktop by DeWitt Mysteries. I gave this 4 stars. This is the 3rd in the series, and the weakest for me so far. But I think other people would really enjoy it depending on what they're invested in the series. This is like a mystery series in which Claire DeWitt is a PI, but subscribed to like a more philosophical, different in search of like man's meaning, existential sort of kind of like Dirk Gently's Detective Service, where it's very like you're solving a mystery based on the detective and not the actual mystery, and it's all very like circuitous and different. And this cashes in the chips of the first two, in which we learn that Claire became a detective after finding this obscure French text, La Tection, and internalized it to a huge degree. And we already know that one of her friends went missing, and this is that story. So it's like a dual narrative thing happening. So you get a resolution of that, but I actually wasn't invested in that part of the story at all. What I kind of already gleaned from it in the first two was fine with me. Because it is a tunneling into her own character and her nature, and those events shaped her into the person that she became and already experienced in the first two books, and to some degree in this third book. It is interesting and still exceeded my expectations, but there's a X factor that is missing, mostly because you kind of understand what the formula and the stakes are going to be immediately with the book if you've read the first two, which you should. It might be actually more interesting to read the third book and then the first two in some ways. But anyway, 4 stars, still really great. The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. I read this as required reading in high school. I still really adore it. I gave it 4 stars, exceeded my expectations. The prose work is phenomenal. I really like the actual structure in which it's a different woman for each chapter, and they all dovetail into one another. And then there's like a grander, unifying plot and theme that is overarching, and I think conveys a heck of a lot for such a slim book, actually. It was very convincing to me, though I don't have too much to actually compare it to other than like historical fiction in which this same-ish structure is adapted, and I have to imagine this book had some say in that. And what else? Yeah, it is in a way a bunch of short stories, at least in the beginning, but I really adore that. I mean, I love David Mitchell books that do a similar thing, and all of the stories were very strong for me. Some people will have a varying degree of liking for it because some of them may not resonate with them. I have seen reviews where that happened, but I'm not one of those people. I just really liked it. I then read Hannibal by Thomas Harris. I've been making my way through all of these. This is, again, a decline. Or the start of the decline, I guess, of the series, because Red Dragon was quite good. Silence of the Lambs was pretty much a masterpiece in my mind, like a modern classic. And then this is a step back. This is exactly as codified in the movie. And so if you've already seen it, there's nothing more that you're gleaning from being in the character, unlike Silence of the Lambs, which adds so much more. So, I don't know. Yeah, this is much more commercial. There's not too much going on. Hannibal is on the lam, and Clarice is kind of getting her detective work on, because Hannibal keeps sending mocking, circuitous messages to her, and he is, of course, feeling like he has to murder some people over there in Italy, and there is a price on his head, which leads to a somewhat corrupt cop in Italy trying to suss him out as well, and Claire comes into the ring, into the centrifugal force of this very rich man who had an experience with Hannibal that led him to be severely crippled and almost dead, and is a terrible, terrible human being, and he's the one with the bounty out on Hannibal. He wants him back alive so he can kill him, do some terrible stuff to him. So the stakes are like kind of interesting, but not really, compared to Silence of the Lambs. Like, they're not trying to find a serial killer, they're trying to find Hannibal. And yeah, like I said, if you have seen the movie, this is exactly and no more what happened. And because it is so formulaic and commercial, you can kind of guess every twist. But if you saw the movie before and kind of forgot about it, it might be a fun thing to revisit. It was pretty fresh in my mind even after a couple of years, so yeah, it was fine. It was a 3-star read. I then read Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, and I really don't like this cover all that much, but I do like the Paper Mill Classics for their covers. It's not hardcover, so it like bites into your hand, but they're resilient enough that it's not just like gonna mess up the front and back covers if you're like a little bit rough with it. So yeah, I don't know. I like the Paper Mill Classics, but this is a little bit of a strange illustration. I think most people are already familiar with this book, so I'm not going to go too far into it, but it exceeded my expectations just because I really enjoy Jane Austen's writing. Like, I think she could pretty much write whatever and I'd sign up for it. It is very like atmospheric and gothic. It is the least interesting that I've read so far, which is why I read it next. I have heard it's sort of her not best work, or maybe sometimes it's Emma for some people as well. But I wanted it to be next just in case it wasn't the best. And then I read something that was like really incredible and followed this up, and it was kind of landed with a thud. So I thought I did it justice, I think, following it in that order. And it's still exceptional in its own ways, but not quite as perfect as Pride and Prejudice. I then read The Handmaid's Tale, and the follow-up will be the sequel. This book was phenomenal. I've been putting it off. I've been a bad Canadian. I just needed to be in a headspace where I wanted to be in a like dystopic, terrible world. And I had already seen the first season of the show, unfortunately, before going into this. So I kind of like felt like I already knew exactly where it was going. But this was absolutely a 5-star read. The prose work is just phenomenal in this, I think. The character work, exceptional. This is, if you don't know somehow, about a dystopia in which it shows a dual timeline type situation where the protagonist is co-opted by a patriarchal government that goes completely fascist and starts subjugating its women, literally into breeding programs or into other sort of service work, and reassert, the olden feudal type system in which the men do all of the work and get all the money, and you slowly get a trickle of information, I guess, as to how this came about, which I thought was mostly believable and exactly how much detail I actually wanted. Some people I've seen in reviews wanted more of that. I didn't. I didn't want this to be like an extra 100 pages or something like that. I thought it was perfectly paced. You learn like about them taking her money and her having like a boyfriend that obviously is unable to do anything for her or willing to do anything for her. She doesn't leave the country when she could. She had a daughter and she doesn't know what's become of her. So there's a whole lot of stakes. And meanwhile, she's become a breeder and has to have sex with this guy under really weird ritualistic circumstances in order to give them a baby via surrogates, like she's a surrogate for them. And they resent her. But over the course of it, she strikes up a pseudo friendship-ish relationship with the man, and it leads her into darker corners and strange underground areas, I guess, of this weird system that has been created. And then you just learn what all happens, because she's trying to find out, obviously, what happened to her kid and try to get free. I think it's really excellent at showing how the system pits women against each other, and how all these different things were taken from different places in the world as having already happened to women, and then coalesced into like a believable system of government that would institute these things. And we just saw Roe versus Wade being taken away in the States, so it's still very prescient. The follow-up, however, to The Handmaid's Tale, The Testaments, I found a little bit lacking. This was more of a 3-star read. It's very much more commercial fiction. It has like a bunch of like short stories, essentially, that are coalesce into a larger form. There's a very protracted reveal that is very perfunctory as well. Like, it's the first thing that you would think of when it's brought up is the reveal. So it kind of like lacks punch, and it's a very lackluster in comparison to the prose work. I would put some sizable distance between the first book and this one, and not read them back to back, because the contrast does not help the book whatsoever. But it does function. It just feels a lot more modern, contemporary, safe. But it does function well as a story. And the structure, more or less, is quite good. Yeah, it was fine and fairly forgettable, essentially. I then read The Test, and it's Sylvain Nouvelle, I think. And this was a 3-star read for me as well. I saw this at Gem of Books. This was a fun audiobook, and I think it's only on Audible, something like that. Like, they produced it and they created it or whatever. It's a very strange circumstance in which a hostage situation is unfolding, and the hostage taker has a weapon. It's in a bank, I believe, and he's asking very strange questions of this guy. He's an immigrant, and there's something important. I think it's like a job interview. He has a lot of internal circumstances and pressure that I think the book does a really good job of rendering. His specific like phobias that he has to deal with via other people because of his immigration status. But it does devolve into a very strange, very hard to believe, at least for me, like meta horror story, I guess, kind of. That's like Cabin in the Woods type situation, where it's just like, this came out of left field. So I think other people will really enjoy that if they buy into the conceit. Whereas for me, I was just like, I can see what this is saying about society, about Britain, about immigrants, but how it coalesces, and especially the ending, felt like it undermined it in the form of the gotcha moment. And so I couldn't say it exceeded my expectations, but I did like enjoy the story and thought it was pretty good. It was a decent thing to consume. And that's my week in reading. I hope you're having a good week. Hope that the holidays aren't super stressful. Hope that you have some sunlight. Sometimes it does feel like we're living in darkness sometimes. Time of the vampires. And yeah, otherwise I will see you next video. Feel free, of course, to interact with me in the comments.